All right, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very excited to be here today, highlighting some of the key updates from CHI's 12th edition of our HIV Market Report. My name is Zach Panos, and I'm joined by my colleagues Jessica Fox and Amy Edmondo, as well as Carolyn Amol. And we all represent CHI's HIV Access Program and are excited to be here highlighting some of our key findings from our latest report. So to give a brief overview of what we'll cover today, we'll start with some high-level trends in the HIV space before moving into updates related to diagnostics, ARV optimization, including advanced HIV disease, and then close out with some updates in the prevention space. So to get started, I think as everyone on this line knows, at the end of 2020, the 90-90-90 era came to a close. And as a result, UNAIDS adopted a new global AIDS strategy outlining strategic directions, priority actions, and new updated targets to end AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. The new 95-95-95 targets are very similar to the 90s targets, really the same, with just a new target of 95% in each category. And if you look at the bottom left of the slide, you can see where we ended up globally in terms of progress against the 90s targets. In terms of testing, we hit 84% of people living with HIV knowing their status. For treatment, 87% of those who knew their status were on treatment. And the third 90, which was the only 90 that was hit at the global level, was that 90% of people on ART had suppressed viral loads. As I mentioned, UNAIDS also updated a number of strategic priorities to achieve the new targets, which you can see on the right, including maximizing equitable access to HIV services, breaking down barriers, as well as fully resourcing and sustaining the efficient HIV response and broader integration into the health system, social protection, humanitarian settings, and of course, pandemic responses. And for much of 2020 and into 2021, there was conflicting research on the impact of COVID-19 on people living with HIV. However, earlier this year, a rather large study from the WHO came out, really sort of putting the definitive stance showing that people living with HIV are at a particularly high risk of serious COVID-19 outcomes and mortality. And the findings of the study were that people living with HIV compared to those who are HIV negative were 13% more likely to be hospitalized with COVID and 30% more likely to die of COVID-19. And so as a result, the WHO released a rather strong statement, as you can see on the right, saying all people living with HIV should be prioritized for early COVID-19 vaccination. However, unfortunately, as many of us are aware, the global COVID-19 vaccine rollout continues to be rather inequitable. And we've shown on the bottom left of this slide, the percent of people receiving at least one COVID-19 vaccine dose by country income status. On the left, you can see in high income countries, 46% of people have received at least one COVID-19 vaccine dose. That number drops to 11% for lower middle income countries and drops even further to just 1% in low income countries, although this data is from the end of June 2021. And another consideration, or rather potential impact of COVID-19 that was feared last year and this year was that we would see widespread COVID-19 related HIV commodity price increases. And I think really on a systematic level, this ended up not being the case. Certainly there were some localized price hikes as well as increases in shipping and freight costs, but a CHI analysis of the weighted average regimen price for adults in pediatrics in what we call generic accessible low and middle income countries, or GALMICs. And for the purpose of this definition, we consider a generic accessible country as a country that's covered under voluntary licenses for generic TDF and TAF. And for both adults in first line and second line, we actually saw the weighted average regimen price decrease from 2019 to 2020. And in the solid bars, we've excluded South Africa from those two numbers, given that there are sort of wide currency fluctuations that could throw off the analysis. And you can see for first line adults, We saw the weighted average regimen price decrease from 70 to 66 US dollars. This is largely due to ongoing price decreases for TLD, as well as optimization away from more expensive regimens as the TLD transition continues. In terms of second line, we saw a decrease of about 5 US dollars, and this is due to ongoing transitions away from more expensive lopinavir, ritonavir toward dolutegravir and atazanavir, ritonavir in second line. We did see an increase in pediatric treatment costs, but this was to be expected last year. Last year, we saw a continued transition away from nevirapine-based regimens, which are particularly inexpensive, towards more expensive lopinavir, ritonavir-based regimens. However, with pediatric dolutegravir rolling out now across sub-Saharan Africa and other low and middle income countries at a low price of just $4.50 per pack, we expect the weighted average treatment price for pediatrics to decrease significantly in the coming years. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jessica, to run us through some updates related to the diagnostic space.
Great, thanks so much, Zach. So I'll now move on to the next section, Test Smart, and talk through some major HIV diagnostic trends. So as we know, COVID-19 disrupted services across the cascade, and testing was no exception. The pandemic impacted services in a number of ways, including the suspension of in-person activities, reallocation of resources toward COVID activities, as well as lockdowns and travel restrictions, which may have made it harder for individuals to access testing services. As a result, we saw a 41% decrease in HIV testing volumes in 2020 compared to 2019, in a Global Fund analysis of 32 countries. And similarly for children, data from PEPFAR found that overall pediatric HIV testing declined by 40%, and further that diagnoses declined by 29% in 2020 compared to 2019, indicating that these declines in testing volumes did impact identification of people living with HIV. And as we move into 2021, COVID continues to have an impact, and initial data suggests that volumes are still below 2019 levels. If we look at the graph on the right, we can see that in these AIDS Healthcare Foundation facilities, more than 1 million fewer people were tested in 2020 compared to 2019. And the final bar on the right shows that the testing volumes for the first half of 2021 are still low. As testing impact has often correlated with COVID-19 waves, it's still to be seen what the effect will be moving forward. So in light of these challenges, innovative approaches to service delivery are increasingly important. And throughout COVID, we've seen partners and national governments rely on a number of adaptations to ensure continuity of care. So looking at the gray call-out box on the left, we can see that a combination of virtual and in-person distribution models were used in Kenya during the pandemic to reach men who have sex with men. And this includes virtual outreach to share information and community distribution of condoms and HIV self-test kits. And similarly, we saw an increase in HIV self-testing in PEPFAR-supported countries during COVID. So looking at the graph on the right, we can see that the number of self-tests distributed increased significantly in Q3 and Q4 of 2020, as well as Q1 of 2021. And all of these innovations played an important role in ensuring access to testing services during the pandemic and will likely continue to do so. So turning now to early infant diagnosis, or EID, we can see that COVID also had an impact. In 2020, there were 1.47 million EID tests run, which is a decrease from the 1.63 million run in 2019. And of these total EID tests, 147,000, or roughly 10%, were run on point of care or POC devices. And looking forward, POC is expected to comprise an increasing proportion of EID volumes. And this is supported by updated WHO guidance that now strongly recommends point of care for EID, given data that shows POC improves treatment initiation. And one such study that we've highlighted in the bottom right was a CHI-led evaluation in 6 African countries. And the study found that with point of care, 72% of caregivers received infant test results on the same day, compared with only 1% with centralized testing. And those who received their test on the same day were 6 times more likely to start treatment within 90 days compared to those diagnosed at a later time. The study really underscores the importance of this new recommendation and the use of point of care EID to identify infants with HIV. For HIV self-testing, there have also been some exciting developments. There are now 6 HIV self-tests with WHO pre-qualification or Global Fund Expert Review Panel for Diagnostics, or ERPD. All of these 6 tests are highlighted on the table on the left. And in addition to this increased supply, several pricing deals also aim to make HIV self-testing more affordable. So for example, the Mylan HIV self-test is now available at an ex-works price of $199 in 135 countries as a result of a UNAIDS-led pricing agreement. Abbott's Check Now HIV self-test is also expected to enter the market at an ex-work price of $150. And finally, OraSure's OraQuick HIV self-test will maintain the $2 ex-work price established via the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation subsidy, and they will expand access to that price to all purchasers of the WHO pre-qualified version intended for public health distribution. Now, these pricing deals and increased supply are also complemented by continued research that shows that HIV self-testing is safe, increases testing uptake, and results in positivity and linkage rates that are comparable to professional HIV testing. And these results, as well as the COVID applications that I discussed earlier, suggest continued growth for HIV self-testing moving forward. And we'll now move into our Treat Right section and begin with treating right by addressing advanced HIV disease, or AHD. So as Zach highlighted in the general trends section, progress has been made across the HIV cascade. However, progress to eliminate AIDS-related deaths is still too slow, and this is particularly true for children living with HIV. So looking at the graph on the left side, there were 680,000 AIDS-related deaths in 2020, which is only a 6% decrease from 2019. For adults, while there have been improvements in treatment, mortality remains stubbornly high. And for children, ART coverage is still too low. And as a consequence, children account for a disproportionately high share of AIDS-related deaths. So as you can see in the top right graph, while children account for only 5% of people living with HIV, they account for 15% of HIV-related deaths. Given this high burden for children, interventions for this population are extremely important. And underscoring this, PEPFAR's 2021 COP guidance highlights the importance of pediatric AHD care, complementing earlier 2020 guidance from the WHO on interventions for children with AHD. Now, one of the key steps in being able to treat advanced HIV disease and eliminate AIDS-related deaths is identifying patients with low CD4 counts. And to this end, a groundbreaking device-free same-day CD4 test, the Visitex CD4 Advanced Disease Test, is now available for procurement at a price of $398 ex-works in over 130 lower and middle income countries. And in order to allow implementers to gain early experience using this test, the Early Market Access Vehicle, or EMAV, is an initiative to support early adoption with the product costs covered by UNAIDS. And as a result, adoption of this product continues to pick up speed, with over 100,000 tests ordered in 8 countries that have already placed or received orders, which are shown in blue in the map on the right. And there are conversations around adoption ongoing in several additional countries, which are highlighted in purple on the map. Additionally, PEPFAR has issued supportive guidance recommending the Visitex CD4 LFA as an inexpensive testing option, further paving the way for continued adoption and rollout. Now, once patients have been identified, diagnosing and treating opportunistic infections is key to reducing deaths. Tuberculosis, or TB, is the leading cause of AIDS-related deaths and the most common opportunistic infection. However, in 2019, only 55% of incident TB cases were diagnosed and notified. And as a result, the 2021 WHO guidelines now include several updated recommendations, which we've highlighted on the bottom left of the slide, which include a recommendation that people living with HIV should be systematically screened for TB at each health facility visit. And we've highlighted a South African study on the right side of the slide, which found that expanded screening for everyone with HIV and others at high risk of TB, in addition to symptom-based screening, increased diagnosis rates by 17% compared to the standard of care, emphasizing the importance of expanded TB screening for people living with HIV. Now, following screening, accurate diagnosis of TB is a critical next step. And to this end, a new urine-based TB LAM test, Sylvamp, is in development by Fujifilm, with ongoing studies expected to conclude by the end of this year. And the studies are focused on HIV-positive adults with signs and symptoms of TB, and the results could be submitted to the WHO as early as the first half of 2022. The test is ultimately expected to improve sensitivity over existing options, which could help improve TB diagnosis for people living with HIV. For those with AHD who have not yet contracted TB, TB preventative therapy is an important tool to prevent future infection. However, rifapentine, a key drug used in preventative therapy, experienced supply issues in 2020 and 2021, although it's expected that the supply capacity will increase into 2022. And there are 2 key products that include this drug. The first is Sanofi's rifapentine single tablets, highlighted on the left. And highlighted on the right side of the slide is Macleod's isoniazid rifapentine fixed dose combination, which is a complete TB preventative therapy. In 2021, nitrosamine impurity issues and quality control clearances affected the supply of both of these products. And for Sanofi's rifapentine singles, the current price is $15 per patient course. However, this price may increase to $18 once backlog orders are filled. For Macleod's fixed dose combination, the COVID-19 pandemic delayed the planned launch and scale up of the product. But Macleod's has committed to scaling up capacity and will continue the $15 per pack access price through 2023 as part of a Med Access, CHI, and UNAIDS-led volume guarantee. Currently, the demand for the Macleod's fixed dose combination outpaces the available supply, and the ARV Procurement Working Group, or APWG, is allocating orders to country programs who are ready to implement this product. Now, another common opportunistic infection among patients with AHD is cryptococcal meningitis, which is responsible for about 15% of AIDS-related deaths. And historical access to screening and treatment for cryptococcal meningitis has been limited in LMICs, but there have been several important recent developments. So looking first at the left side of the slide, an updated cryptococcal meningitis strategic framework has highlighted several key steps to end cryptococcal meningitis deaths by 2030. And one of these key recommendations is addressing gaps in access to key medicines. Historically, two of these key medicines have been flucytosine, or 5-FC, and amphotericin B deoxycholate. However, amphotericin deoxycholate has significant toxicities, requiring extensive resources to monitor and manage complications. So in the center of the slide, we've highlighted some exciting results from the Ambition CM trial, which suggests that one high dose of liposomal amphotericin B is non-inferior to the standard of care with amphotericin deoxycholate. And this has the potential to drastically simplify cryptococcal meningitis management, reduce toxicity, and lower costs of treatment. And finally, on the right side of the slide, we've highlighted procurement of these medicines with placed orders for 5-FC highlighted in blue, and those with placed orders for liposomal amphotericin B in purple. For tools to support the rollout of these products and other AHD commodities, you can visit the AHD toolkit using the link at the bottom of the slide. I'll now hand it over to Amy to discuss highlights in the adult ARV space.
Thanks, Jessica. So in this section, I'll be talking about some of the trends in HIV infections among adults, as well as the latest trends in treatment and some of the exciting pipeline products. So as we all know, and as Zach mentioned earlier in this presentation, many people feared COVID-19 might result in a dramatic impact on the HIV response. But when we look at some of the latest statistics on adults living with HIV, we can see that this wasn't necessarily the case for infection and treatment levels. As you can see on the left, in 2020, there were 36 million adults living with HIV globally. And of these, approximately 26.6 million were on antiretroviral treatment, which is about a 74% global treatment coverage for adults. And on the right, we can see that in generic accessible LMICs, there are about 22 million adults on ART, that's indicated in the dark blue bars. And adult ART coverage in 2020 was similar to global rates indicated by the red line. At 75% ART coverage in 2020, this indicates an increase of 5 percentage points, which is pretty impressive given fears that COVID-19 would disrupt treatment initiation and retention in care. So with all these people on treatment, let's get into some of the medications that people in LMICs are taking. Increasingly, we're seeing that people are on dolutegravir-based regimens. We now estimate that there's about 15 million people on DTG-based regimens in LMICs in both first and second line treatment, with over 350 million 30-pack equivalents procured since 2017. On the right side is CHI's forecast for NNRTIs and INSTIs. At the end of 2020, which is in the first left-hand column, we can see that 67% of adult first-line patients were on DTG, which is a 38 percentage point increase from 2019. And some countries, which we've indicated on this slide, have already transitioned over 90% of first-line adults on DTG. We anticipate that the number of people on DTG will increase over the next few years, reaching over 90% by 2022. While Favrins and the Nevirapine regimens will compose a smaller market share over time as they're phased out. Next slide. Thanks. In terms of the potential benefits of TLD for second-line optimization, data from the NADIA trial was released earlier this year that looked at the efficacy of DTG when prescribed alongside an NRTI backbone. It also explored the WHO guidelines, which indicate a switch of the NRTI backbone when transitioning from first to second-line treatment. So you can see a simplified chart of the study design on the left side of this slide. So patients failing TDF and an NRTI first-line regimen were randomized to have the NNRTI switch to either DTG or darunavir/ritonavir, and then further randomized to either stay on TDF or switch to AZT per WHO recommendations. So on the right, we can see 48-week key findings. So first, retaining TDF in second line was found to be non-inferior to switching to AZT. And secondly, both DTG and darunavir/ritonavir were found to be equally effective in second line. These findings emphasize the importance of switching patients to DTG or to darunavir/ritonavir if they're unable to take DTG. While this evidence supports the potential use of TLD in second line, the WHO has not updated their guidelines, and any national programs that are intending to implement TLD in second line will have to evaluate these findings prior to local adoption. So the results from the NADIA trial, combined with the arrival of a generic, affordable, fixed-dose combination of darunavir/ritonavir, have led to some pretty exciting changes in second-line market dynamics. As we mentioned previously, a number of countries have completed their first-line transitions to TLD, and some countries are now beginning to or planning to transition stable second-line patients from protease inhibitors, such as lopinavir/ritonavir, to DTG, as you can see on the left. We expect this list to grow considerably over the next few years. On the right, we can see these dynamics reflected in the second line PI and INSTI market share in generic accessible LMICs, in which we can see the appearance of DTG in 2020 at 8%, and that's indicated in the blue on the far right bar. The share of DTG in second line is expected to increase dramatically as countries complete their first line transitions and accelerate use in second line. And within the PI market, atazanavir/ritonavir has been steadily gaining in share against lopinavir/ritonavir, and with an affordable fixed-dose combination of darunavir/ritonavir now on the market, we expect it to make up a larger share of the PI market moving forward. So with that, let's dive a little bit more into the use of darunavir/ritonavir for use in second line. Darunavir/ritonavir in the 450 milligram fixed dose combination is a long-awaited optimal product for use in second line that recently received WHO pre-qualification. On the right, we can see some key benefits of darunavir/ritonavir, including a high genetic barrier to resistance, improved rates of viral suppression over other products, better tolerability, the ability to be reused in third line at a slightly higher dose, and with a new pricing deal from Chai and UNAIDS for heteros generic fixed dose combination at a cost of $17.50 per pack X-Works, the darunavir/ritonavir fixed dose combination is now slightly cheaper than lopinavir/ritonavir. To access tools and resources to support the introduction of darunavir/ritonavir into country programs, we encourage folks to check out the HIV New Product Introduction Toolkit website, which now has a page dedicated to this product. So weight gain on optimal regimens continues to be a topic of conversation in the HIV space, and studies continue to show that weight gain among people on ART is the most pronounced among those on DTG and TAF-containing regimens. Some of the most prominent data from this topic comes from the ADVANCE trial, which you can see on the left. And recently, a supplementary genotyping study was conducted on some of the participants from the ADVANCE trial. And they found that, in fact, participants in the efavirenz arm metabolized the drug at different rates. Of those who metabolized efavirenz slowly, weight gain was impaired due to increased toxicity and side effects. And among those who metabolized efavirenz quickly, they actually gained weight at similar rates to DTG-containing regimens, which is in line with weight gain trends more broadly in South Africa, which is where the study was conducted. On the right-hand side is CHI's forecast for NRTIs in first line. In 2020, we can see that 96% of patients were on TDF-containing regimens. And with uncertainty about broader TAF rollout, CHI predicts that TAF will constitute a very small portion of adult NRTI use in the coming years. With that said, the recent VESTED trial shows that there may be a potential use case for TAF and DTG in women initiating ART in pregnancy. In this study, women who started a TAF and DTG containing regimen gained weight comparable to gestational standards, while women on other regimens were consistently underweight. Additionally, low maternal weight was associated with adverse pregnancy outcomes. As we can see on the right, pregnant women on the TAF and DTG containing regimens in dark blue had lower rates of adverse events and a lower risk of neonatal death as compared to pregnant women on other regimens. And while these findings are definitely fascinating, more research will be needed in regard to this use case. As we mentioned previously at the beginning of this presentation, multi-month dispensing is a trend that was accelerated in 2020 as COVID forced treatment programs to find a way to reduce in-person visits while maintaining the continuity of HIV services. Earlier this year, the WHO began recommending that patients established on ART be offered clinical visits and refill schedules every 3 to 6 months, with a preference for 6 months if possible. We've included a few examples on the bottom of this slide of research, procurement, and implementation that supports this guidance. These include lower provider costs, increased orders of larger pack sizes, and changes to national guidelines to support MMD. So I'll now shift to talk about some of the exciting products in the treatment pipeline. First up is ViiV and Janssen's Cabenuva, or cabotegravir and rilpivirine, which is a monthly injection for HIV treatment. On the left, we can see that evidence from 2 trials, FLAIR and ATLAS, showed that cabotegravir and rilpivirine maintained viral suppression and were non-inferior to existing oral regimens. This evidence was used to apply for US FDA approval in virally suppressed treatment-experienced patients, and that was approved in January of this year. In February, ViiV and Janssen applied for a supplemental application based on the results of the ATLAS 2M trial, which showed that administration of cabotegravir and rilpivirine is non-inferior to monthly injections. Administration every 8 weeks. And this is currently under review by the US FDA. While the shift away from daily oral therapy is definitely exciting, there are some considerations about the use of cabotegravir and rilpivirine in low and middle income countries, including cost, a low barrier to resistance, cold chain storage requirements, and the inability to cross-treat for Hep B. Next slide. So lastly, I'll be discussing Merck's islatravir and Gilead's lenacapavir, which represent a shift towards longer-acting products and present alternative options to existing oral treatment and prevention therapies. Late-breaking results in the past week from the Illuminate trial indicate that viral suppression with daily oral islatravir is comparable to existing ART regimens, which is indicated in the purple box. And results from the Calibrate and the Capella trials indicate that daily oral lenacapavir or 6-month injectable lenacapavir result in sufficient viral suppression, leading Gilead to submit a new drug application with the US FDA for lenacapavir use in treatment-experienced people living with HIV with multi-drug resistant HIV. Additionally, Gilead and Merck recently announced a partnership to combine these first-in-class products, starting with a phase 2 trial combining islatravir with lenacapavir in a once-weekly oral regimen. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jessica to talk about some updates in the pediatric treatment space.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. So I'll spend this next section of the presentation reviewing highlights from the pediatric ARV space, including some of the exciting developments around pediatric dolutegravir. In 2020, for the first time, the number of children on ART globally declined, but slight improvements in case finding could drastically increase coverage. So in 2020, there were 1.7 million children living with HIV globally, with 920,000 on ART, meaning that global pediatric coverage was only 54%. And there are a number of causes for the decline in the number of children living with HIV on ART. including children are aging out of the pediatric cohort, and there's often poor retention in care, with one study in sub-Saharan Africa showing that 1 in 5 children on ART under 5 are lost to follow-up. And finally, there have been declines in pediatric case finding, as I discussed in the Test Smart section, meaning that fewer children with HIV are being identified. If we look at the graph on the right, we can see this decline in the number of children on ART and GA LMICs in the blue bars, with the estimate status quo represented by the gray line. However, with only a 5% year-over-year increase in the number of children on ART, which is represented by the light blue bars and the pink line, ART coverage could increase significantly over the next 5 years and achieve almost 100% coverage. Innovative strategies to achieve this goal must be a focus moving forward. So turning to updates in treatment for children, there have been some exciting developments this year. An optimal pediatric formulation of DTG is now available from 2 suppliers at a price well below the previous standard of care. Dolutegravir 10 mg dispersible scored tablets, also known as pediatric DTG or PEDS DTG, has received 2 US FDA tentative approvals. And the development of this product was expedited through a CHI and UNAIDS incentive program, where Viatris and McLeod's, the 2 generic suppliers, received technical knowledge transfer from ViiV, the innovator company, and engaged in an innovative US FDA filing strategy. On the right side of the slide, you can see that through this innovative filing strategy, Viatris and McLeod's were allowed to file their US FDA applications concurrently with ViiV's innovator application, allowing Viatris to receive tentative approval just 5 months after ViiV's product was approved. This is the fastest ever regulatory approval of a generic ARV and was 25 times faster than the average pediatric HIV treatment approval and 15 times faster than the average generic adult HIV treatment approval. Additionally, there are no capacity or supply challenges anticipated for this product, and accessibility has also been increased through a UNAIDS pricing agreement, which has made PEDS DTG available at an ex-work price of $450 US per 90 pack in over 123 countries. This reduced price will generate significant global health savings that could amount to between $60 and $260 million over 5 years. This work and the expedited development of PEDS DTG has ultimately allowed children in LMICs to access optimal treatment years before it would have otherwise been available. And we see this with a rapid rollout of PEDS DTG with widespread adoption and supportive partner guidance. Early procurement of PEDS DTG was initiated in 6 countries to catalyze interest, and since then there have been 17 countries with confirmed deliveries. Beyond this, as you can see in the map on the right, many additional countries have placed orders for PEDS DTG, which are highlighted in dark blue, and more have procurement conversations ongoing, which are highlighted in light blue. PEPFAR, among other partners, has issued supportive guidance and expects a full transition within 12 months of the first shipment of PEDS DTG. And looking forward, we expect this adoption and scale up to continue as countries implement the WHO preferred regimen for children living with HIV. And this is complemented by WHO guidance on PEDS DTG transitions, as well as continued data on clinical superiority and cost savings. As we've highlighted on the left side of the slide, the WHO emphasizes that viral load monitoring remains a good practice, but should not be considered a precondition to PEDS DTG transitions. And this is complemented by data from a South African CPAC modeling study, which we've shown on the right side of the slide, which looked at cost savings and total life years for 3 patient groups. As you can see in the chart, life expectancy or total life years for both DTG arms was greater than the non-DTG arm, and life expectancy was highest for the group switched without viral load testing. Further, the study also found that there were cost savings in both DTG arms compared to the non-DTG group. And ultimately, both these results and the WHO guidance emphasize that PEDS DTG access should not be delayed. As countries are beginning this transition, planning and community engagement are key to a successful and rapid rollout. So on the left side of the slide, we've highlighted some key introduction resources, with many more available on the HIV New Products Introduction Toolkit, with that link included at the bottom left. And on the right side of the slide, we've briefly outlined the important role that community advisory boards, or CABs, play in product rollout and resource development, with some key CAB resources included on the bottom right of the slide. Now, we've established that DTG will play a significant role in pediatric treatment moving forward. But if we look back at historical regimen splits, In 2020, DTG use was about 18% of children on pediatric formulations. And this is because DTG was limited to children living with HIV over 20 kilograms who were able to take DTG 50 milligram tablets, given that PEDS DTG was not yet available. So in 2020, lopinavir still comprised the majority of pediatric regimens, with 53% of children on a lopinavir-based regimen. However, data from the Odyssey trial suggests that less than 5% of children are expected to need non-DTG-based regimens. So we expect this share to decrease drastically as DTG dominates the treatment landscape. And as we talk about optimization, in 2021, an updated WHO optimal formulary and limited use list was released, which includes the minimum number of formulations needed for WHO preferred pediatric regimens. And the optimal formulary, which is highlighted on this slide, reemphasizes the prioritization of PEDS DTG among a few other updates that we've briefly highlighted here. And on this slide, we've highlighted the new limited use list, which has been pared down significantly, and a number of products were removed from this list, including those listed on the right side of the slide. A few updated pediatric recommendations were also included in the 2021 WHO Consolidated Guidelines. So as we mentioned in the adult section, multi-month dispensing was expanded to children. And at the bottom left of the slide, we've included a few countries where this recommendation has already been introduced. And on the right side of the slide, you'll also find a new recommendation that psychosocial interventions should be provided to all adolescents and young adults with HIV. And these interventions include, among others, family-based interventions to promote mental health. These service delivery changes should be considered as programs work to optimize pediatric treatment. Now, looking forward, there are several pediatric products that are currently in the development pipeline. However, countries should prioritize PEDS DTG transitions to allow children to access the best available treatment as soon as possible. The first pipeline product I'll highlight, which is on the left side of the slide, is fixed-dose pediatric ABC3TC DTG, or PEDS ALD. And currently the development of this product is ongoing as a collaboration between CHI, UNAIDS, and ViiV. However, as I mentioned, programs should not wait for the triple fixed-dose combination and instead should take rapid advantage of DTG 10 milligram singles. Pediatric darunavir ritonavir in the center of the slide is also currently in development, and it's a best-in-class PI with likely use among children who may eventually fail DTG-based therapies. Historically, high API costs and low volumes have been barriers to development, but CHI and UNAIDS launched an incentive program and request for proposals to catalyze development in September of 2020, and Loris Labs was awarded the incentive contract as the generic development partner in September of this year. Finally, on the right side of the slide, pediatric TAF has the potential for use as a backbone NRTI in pediatric patients. However, clinical data is needed here. Penta did receive a grant to investigate dosing and provide some of this other clinical data, and CHI is currently supporting as a formulation development partner. Now we'll close out the section with treat right with appropriate monitoring and delve into trends for viral load and CD4 monitoring. So among the many other updates we've discussed from the new 2021 WHO guidelines, the WHO now conditionally recommends point of care viral load testing to monitor treatment for 6 priority populations. These populations, which are highlighted in the bottom left, are those where timely return of results is particularly important, and they include, among others, pregnant women and patients with AHT. We estimate that these groups comprise over 20% of people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, so point of care viral load will play an important role moving forward. Now, in tandem to this, the WHO has also updated the treatment monitoring algorithm, and on this slide, we'll highlight some of the important changes here. First, the algorithm clarifies that results from the first viral load test should be available within 6 months after starting ART, and this helps to ensure that providers are able to assess how the patient is doing on treatment at the 6-month mark. Next, looking to the left side of the slide, the new algorithm differentiates between patients who have undetectable viral loads, so less than 50 copies per milliliter, and patients who have suppressed but detectable viral load results, or between 50 and 1,000 copies per milliliter. For those patients who are suppressed but detectable, enhanced adherence counseling is recommended. The algorithm also now recommends that the ART regimen should be switched after 1 elevated viral load result if the person is on an NNRTI-based regimen. And finally, it's also clarified that the second viral load test should be conducted 3 months after the initial elevated viral load test. So as we turn now to viral load testing volumes, on this slide, we've included the 2020 viral load tests run in global LMICs and our forecast for 2021 to 2025. Between 2019 and 2020, testing volumes have remained relatively flat. However, viral suppression levels were mostly unchanged, which suggests that ART access was sustained during the pandemic. Looking forward, we expect viral load volumes to increase to about 33 million tests in 2025. And this year, we've also included point of care estimates in the forecast, which show expected conservative growth in point of care viral load. However, there are several market conditions that could increase point of care, including if programs expand point of care to all of the WHO priority populations that I mentioned earlier, if device placement programs become more competitive, or if the price of point of care tests decrease. And finally, to close out this section, we'll briefly look at CD4 testing volumes and forecasted volumes. We estimate that 11.7 million device-based CD4 tests were conducted in 2020. And while viral load remains the gold standard for treatment monitoring, CD4 testing does still have an important role in identifying patients with AHD. So while we expect the overall need and demand for CD4 testing to decrease, it is still critical for people with advanced HIV disease to receive life-saving care. So I'll now hand it back over to Amy to close us out with Stay Negative.
Thanks, Jessica. I recognize that we have about 15 minutes left. So if you have questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A or the chat function in advance so that we can answer them in the last few minutes of our presentation. So in this section, I'll be looking at progress to date in HIV prevention and then some of the exciting prevention products in development. So despite progress in HIV prevention over the past decade, which has seen a 30% drop in new infections from 2.1 million in 2010 to 1.5 million in 2020, new HIV infections in 2020 were still 3 times the UNAIDS targets for 2020, which was 500,000. And as Zach mentioned earlier, UNAIDS has released a new strategy for the HIV response alongside new targets. Achieving the new UNAIDS 2025 targets, which aim to reduce annual HIV infections to less than 370,000 by 2025, will require a renewed focus on effective and equitable rollout of combination prevention approaches, an increased focus on key populations and their partners, and introduction of new effective prevention products that give users greater choice. And speaking of key populations and their partners, in the top right graph, we can see that new infections globally are increasingly concentrated among key populations and their partners. This comprised 44% of new infections in 2015 and now 65% of new infections in 2020. However, there are regional differences which should be noted. When we look at sub-Saharan Africa, we find that only 39% of new infections in 2020 were among key populations and their partners, while outside of sub-Saharan Africa, key populations and their partners constituted 93% of new infections in 2020. Oh, sorry, we're missing something on this slide. I'll talk you through it though. Oh, no, it's still missing. Okay, so similarly, when we look at vertical transmission and HIV infections in children, we see that there's also regional differences. So in what was in the graph on the left, there was HIV infections in children against ART coverage among pregnant women. So we would have seen that while infections in children are reducing, ART coverage among pregnant women has historically been high, over 85%. It has remained stagnant since about 2014. And when we look at gaps in ART coverage among pregnant women, we find that 60% of all pregnant women living with HIV who are not on ART in 2020 were in West and Central Africa. And Nigeria alone represents 23% of the global gap in ART coverage. And among infections in children, 80% are represented by 21 UNAIDS focus countries, which we can see broken down in this pie chart on the right side of the slide. Of these, 2/3 of infections are in 6 countries, And Nigeria again represents nearly 1/5 of new HIV infections in children aged 0 to 14. So special attention will likely need to be placed on these countries moving forward. Next slide. So as we know from earlier slides, there was considerable worry that COVID-19 would impact HIV services. Among prevention services, this impact was varied in the areas of voluntary medical male circumcision and oral PrEP. Starting with VMMC on the left side of the slide, male circumcision performance varied across countries in East and Southern Africa. Starting with the graph, we can see that male circumcision overall decreased pretty significantly between 2019 and 2020. However, when we look at country level data, there are some differences. In South Africa, for instance, there was a 64% decrease in male circumcisions performed, whereas in Zambia, we see that there was only a 20% increase in male circumcisions performed. And these differences point to the various impacts of COVID-19 on a country by country basis, with some having different lockdown policies and others transitioning to a virtual demand generation approach. Now, if we look at oral PrEP on the right side of the slide, many programs continue to grow despite the pandemic. As of June 2021, there are approximately 1 million oral PrEP initiations in low and middle income countries, and over 80% of these occurred in 2020 and 2021, which is fairly impressive. We've highlighted some of select countries here, which saw significant oral PrEP initiation growth. There were a number of approaches that enabled this, including virtual demand generation, multi-month dispensing, and community-based delivery of oral PrEP. So now we'll discuss some of the recently approved prevention products and products in the development pipeline. So the dipivirine vaginal ring, which recently received WHO pre-qualification, is a flexible silicone ring that women can insert into the vagina for monthly protection against HIV. A series of phase 3 efficacy trials and open label extensions found that the dipivirine vaginal ring can reduce the risk of HIV acquisition between 27 and 63%. WHO guidelines note that the current evidence suggests that oral PrEP, when taken as prescribed, has greater efficacy for HIV prevention than the ring. Given the ring's lower efficacy, it's important to note that oral PrEP should be offered at sites where the ring is provided to enable women to make a choice with full information on the relative efficacy and safety of both products. The ring should only be offered as a prevention option in combination with other combination prevention methods and for women who are unable or do not want to take oral PrEP. Given how new this product is, the WHO has called out a number of implementation considerations, as well as research gaps that need to be considered before wider implementation. Note that Zimbabwe became the first country to approve use of the ring, and it's still under review by the US FDA and other regulatory bodies. Notably, the ring debuted with a price of just under $13 ex-works per monthly ring, which is still considerably more expensive than the monthly cost of oral PrEP. VEEV's long-acting cabotegravir, or CAB-LA, is an injectable form of PrEP that's administered every 8 weeks. 2 efficacy trials, you can see them on the left side, HPTN 083 and 084, demonstrated that CAB-LA is safe and highly effective at preventing HIV and is superior to daily oral TDF and FTC. Both of these studies were actually unblinded due to the success of CAB-LA. In terms of regulatory updates, in May of this year, VEEV, who is the innovator and developed CAB-LA, initiated a rolling new drug application with the US FDA and was granted priority review. A decision is expected in January of 2022, and if approved, CAB-LA would be the first long-acting therapy for HIV PrEP. You may recognize this slide from earlier in the presentation in the treatment section. As I mentioned, islatravir and lenacapavir are 2 exciting products that are being considered for both treatment and prevention. Both are being studied as long-acting PrEP options. These include oral, implant, and injectable formulations, and this has exciting implications for the prevention space. Next slide. So Merck is beginning phase 3 efficacy trials for islatravir as once monthly oral PrEP, as you can see on the left. Safety and efficacy studies, Empower 22 and Empower 24, will compare monthly oral islatravir to daily oral TDF and FTC among cisgender women, men who have sex with men, and transgender women. Additionally, Merck is planning further studies of a new formulation of islatravir in the form of a small removable implant. Phase 1 study results show that the islatravir implant could provide over a year of sufficient drug levels to act as PrEP or form part of combination ARV therapy for well over 1 year. Similarly, this year, Gilead began the Purpose 1 and 2 trials to investigate the 6-month subcutaneous injectable form of lenacapavir for PrEP among adolescent girls and young women, men, and people of the trans experience. So as we can see, the product pipeline for HIV prevention is robust and diverse, with novel long-acting products holding the potential to expand user choice with more acceptable options, while also reducing user barriers associated with daily use. So we're very excited about this. So before we open this session up to the group, we want to extend our gratitude to our donors who have made this work possible, including UNAIDS, the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which fund CHI's work to improve access to life-saving health commodities. We thank everyone for your time, and with that, I want to open it up to some questions.